Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a truly bizarre corner of history. One where the line between waking and dreaming got blurry, and people did some truly wild things without even knowing it. Imagine this, you're tucked snug in your bed, the moon, a silver sliver peeking through the curtains. The house is silent, save for the gentle creak of old wood settling. You drift off, your mind a calm, unbothered sea. But then, without a single conscious thought, your eyes flutter open, not fully awake, mind you, just open. Your legs swing over the side of the bed, your feet find the cool floor, and you start to move. Perhaps you wander down the hall, maybe even out the front door, still lost in the deep currents of sleep. You might, just might, find yourself scaling a rooftop or reorganizing your neighbor's prize-winning petunias, all while your waking self is blissfully unaware. Sounds like a plot from a particularly unsettling dream, right? Well, for Europe, this wasn't just a dream, it was an obsession. A real bona fide fascination that seeped into everything from medical journals to scandalous courtroom dramas. And you, my friend, you're about to wade right into the middle of it. Honestly, you probably won't survive this journey with your understanding of reality fully intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe button. Only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the precipice of an era defined by gaslight, corsets, and a surprisingly robust fascination with the human mind's nocturnal adventures. The 19th century, with its burgeoning scientific curiosity and lingering romantic mysticism, found itself utterly captivated by somnambulism, as sleepwalking was formerly known. This wasn't just a quirky anecdote. It was a phenomenon that challenged prevailing notions of consciousness, free will, and even the very nature of the soul. Before this period, sleepwalking was often relegated to the realm of demonic possession or divine intervention. You might hear whispers of witches flying at night or mischievous spirits guiding the unsuspecting sleeper. It was a dark, superstitious affair, best left to the local priest or an exorcist, if you were truly unlucky. But as the 1800s dawned and progressed, a shift began. The Enlightenment had laid the groundwork for rational inquiry, and suddenly people wanted answers. They wanted to dissect, categorize, and understand. A mainstream historical fact you absolutely need to grasp is that this era saw a dramatic move away from purely supernatural explanations for unexplained phenomena towards a more scientific, albeit still primitive, understanding. Doctors, philosophers, and even playwrights began to view sleepwalking not as a curse, but as a perplexing medical mystery. You see, the sheer spectacle of someone performing complex actions, walking, talking, writing letters, even playing musical instruments, all while seemingly profoundly asleep, was utterly baffling. How could the body function with such autonomy, such purpose, when the mind, the very seat of consciousness, was supposedly at rest? It defied logic, it defied common sense, and it absolutely terrified and thrilled them in equal measure. It was this potent cocktail of fear and fascination that propelled somnambulism into the public consciousness. You'd find discussions about it in polite drawing rooms, hushed conversations in dimly lit cafes, and fervent debates in academic lecture halls. It became a lens through which they explored the subconscious, a concept that was just beginning to emerge from the shadows of philosophical thought. A quirky tidbit, perhaps a little unsettling, is that some 19th-century accounts even describe sleepwalkers navigating incredibly dangerous terrain, like narrow rooftops or precarious cliffs, with an almost preternatural agility, only to wake up utterly disoriented and terrified of their impossible nocturnal feats. It made you wonder, didn't it? Was there some hidden faculty, some dormant ability that only surfaced when the conscious mind was at bay? Historians still argue whether this widespread fascination was a genuine scientific pursuit or merely a reflection of a society grappling with rapid technological and social change, seeking new frontiers of mystery to conquer. Perhaps it was a bit of both. A convenient canvas onto which they could project their anxieties about the unknown aspects of human nature. The very idea that you could be an active participant in the world while completely unconscious was profoundly disturbing. It chipped away at the comforting certainty of self-control. You thought you knew yourself, knew your own actions. But what if a part of you, a shadowy, autonomous part, was capable of anything, without your permission, without your memory? This was the unsettling realization that truly fueled the 19th century obsession with sleepwalking, setting the stage for a period rife with medical experiments, theatrical displays, and some truly wild tales. As the 19th century progressed, the mystical veil began to lift, or at least people desperately tried to yank it away. You see, with this newfound fascination came an equally fervent desire to medicalize the phenomenon. Doctors, with their burgeoning understanding of anatomy and physiology, looked at sleepwalking not as a spiritual affliction, but as a malfunction of the human machine. They were the original tech support, trying to figure out why your internal operating system was running rogue programs at 3 a.m. This push for medical classification was a significant leap, marking a fundamental shift in how society perceives these nocturnal wanderings. No longer was it just the purview of folklore. It was now a case for the stethoscope and the keen observational eye. You can almost picture them, these earnest 19th century physicians, hunched over their desks by the glow of a gas lamp, poring over detailed case studies. They tried to categorize everything. Was it a form of epilepsy, a nervous disorder, or perhaps something entirely new, something that defied their existing diagnostic frameworks? The language they used might sound a bit quaint to our modern ears. Terms like nervous excitability or brain congestion were thrown around with surprising regularity. But beneath the archaic terminology lay a genuine attempt to bring scientific rigor to something that was inherently elusive, a mainstream historical fact. Here is that the rise of neurology as a distinct medical field directly paralleled this growing interest in conditions like somnambulism, as they offered tantalizing clues about the brain's complex workings. They developed intricate classifications, attempting to distinguish between different types of sleepwalking. You might find yourself reading about simple somnambulism, where someone just wanders around confused, versus lucid somnambulism, where the sleeper could carry out surprisingly complex and purposeful actions. Imagine a doctor meticulously documenting the exact route a patient took through their home, the words they mumbled, or the objects they interacted with. It was all about observation, gathering data, trying to find patterns in what seemed like pure chaos. And yet, for all their detailed record-keeping, the underlying cause remained stubbornly out of reach. It was like trying to diagnose a software bug by just watching the screen, without any access to the code. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this period is the sheer variety of treatments proposed for somnambulism. You might find doctors advocating for cold baths to shock the system back to normalcy, or the application of leeches to the temples to reduce brain inflammation. Some even suggested a strict regimen of bland foods and early bedtimes, as if a good night's sleep and a bowl of gruel could simply banish the nocturnal wanderer within. It was a classic case of throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck, often with little regard for actual efficacy. You can almost hear the sighs of exasperated patients trying to explain to their doctor that, no, another cold bath probably wouldn't stop them from sleep climbing the neighbor's fence. Historians still argue whether these early medical attempts were genuine scientific endeavors or largely speculative ventures driven more by a desire for professional legitimacy than by empirical evidence. It's easy to look back and scoff at some of their methods, but remember, they were operating without the benefit of brain imaging, neurochemistry, or even a basic understanding of REM sleep. They were essentially flying blind, armed only with their intellect and a healthy dose of professional hubris. The very act of trying to define and categorize sleepwalking, even if imperfectly, laid the groundwork for future research. The way for the later understanding that the brain, even when supposedly at rest, is a hive of activity, capable of orchestrating incredible feats without direct conscious command. So, while their remedies might seem comical now, their determination to bring sleepwalking into the medical fold was a crucial step in unraveling one of nature's most enduring mysteries. Now, as these earnest doctors were trying to pin down sleepwalking with their scalpels and classifications, another, far more theatrical, force was sweeping across Europe: mesmerism. You've probably heard the term mesmerized before, meaning utterly captivated or spellbound. Well, that comes directly from Franz Mesmer, an Austrian physician who, in the late 18th century, introduced the concept of animal magnetism. He believed that a universal, invisible fluid flowed through all living things, and that illness resulted from blockages or imbalances in this fluid. His solution: to manipulate it, often by passing his hands over patients, sometimes with a flourish, sometimes with a mysterious gaze, inducing what he called crises or magnetic sleep. And it was in this magnetic sleep that a fascinating, and to the 19th century mind, utterly mind-blowing connection to somnambulism emerged. You see, Mesmer and his followers, often called magnizers, claimed they could induce a state remarkably similar to natural sleepwalking. Their patients, under the influence of this animal magnetism, would enter a trance-like state where they could answer questions, describe internal ailments, and even perform actions, all while seemingly unconscious. This was the birth of the mesmeric trance, and it threw a massive wrench into the purely physiological explanations of sleepwalking. If you could make someone sleepwalk, or at least act like they were, what did that say about the nature of consciousness? Was it a medical condition, or was it something that could be manipulated, controlled, even performed? A mainstream historical fact is that mesmerism, despite its eventual debunking by the scientific establishment, was incredibly popular and influential. Throughout the early to mid-19th century, it wasn't just a fringe movement. It attracted crowds, captivated intellectuals, and even influenced early psychological thought. You'd find mesmeric clinics popping up in major European cities, attracting everyone from the desperate sick to the merely curious. The idea that a charismatic individual could tap into some hidden force and unlock latent abilities in others was profoundly appealing in an era still grappling with the limits of scientific understanding. The hidden depths of the human psyche, long before Freud even dreamed of a couch. The connection to somnambulism was particularly potent. If a magnetizer could put someone into a state where they walked, talked, and responded to commands while asleep, it seemed to validate the idea that natural sleepwalkers were simply experiencing a spontaneous version of this induced trance. It blurred the lines between conscious and unconscious, between illness and performance. One quirky or fringe tidbit is that some mesmeric practitioners claimed their somnambulist subjects could even perform clairvoyance, or diagnosing illnesses in others while in their trance state. Imagine the scene: a dimly lit room, a hushed audience, and a sleepwalker describing a distant relative's ailment with uncanny accuracy. It was the ultimate parlor trick, or perhaps the ultimate frontier of the mind, depending on your credulity. Historians still argue whether mesmerism was a genuine precursor to modern hypnotism or merely a sophisticated form of placebo effect and showmanship. Was it the magnetizer's power or the subject's suggestibility? Critics dismissed it as quackery, charlatanism, designed to fleece the gullible. Yet its undeniable impact on popular culture and its role in sparking early discussions about the subconscious mind cannot be overlooked. It forced people to consider that there were layers to the mind beyond simple waking awareness, and that these layers could manifest in astonishing, often unsettling ways. So, while the doctors tried to dissect the sleepwalker's brain, the mesmerists were busy proving that the mind, even when seemingly dormant, held secrets that could be unlocked with a wave of the hand and a compelling gaze. Contradictory, period, where science and showmanship danced a very strange tango. With doctors scratching their heads and messimists captivating crowds, it was inevitable that sleepwalking would bleed into the very, you see, society often reflects its deepest anxieties and fascinations. In its art, and somnambulism became a powerful, almost irresistible motif. It offered a ready-made narrative device for exploring themes of hidden desires, fractured identities, and the unsettling boundaries between reason and madness. You'd find it popping up everywhere in the grand romantic poems, the dark Gothic novels, and even on the vibrant stages of European theater. Imagine the gaslit drawing rooms of London or Paris, where fashionable ladies and gentlemen would discuss the latest sensational case of a sleepwalker. These weren't just abstract medical curiosities. Alluring, it tapped into a universal human fear, the loss of control, the idea that a part of you might be a complete stranger. A mainstream historical fact is that the Romantic movement, with its emphasis on emotion, the subconscious, artists and writers were less interested in the medical diagnosis and more in the poetic implications of a mind in literature. You might encounter the innocent maiden tormented by night terrors that lead her to dangerous precipices, a classic trope playing on vulnerability and the sublime. Or perhaps the guilt-ridden murderer whose sleepwalking reveals their dark secrets, a psychological torment made manifest. Think of Lady Macbeth, famously scrubbing invisible blood from her hands in her sleep, a scene that resonates with the horrifying reality of a mind consumed by its own darkness, acting out its torments without conscious will. Her actions, performed in the liminal state between waking and sleeping, are far more chilling than any confession. Or, fringe tidbit, is that some authors even played with the idea of shared somnambulism, where two or more individuals would supposedly experience similar nocturnal wanderings, or even act in concert while asleep. While scientifically improbable, this concept added another layer of eerie mystery and was perfect fodder for ghost stories and tales of supernatural influence. Drawn by an unseen force, it was the stuff of thrilling penny dreadfuls, captivating readers who craved a brush with the uncanny. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of sleepwalking in 19th century art was merely a sensationalist trend, or a deeper societal commentary on the emerging understanding of the subconscious mind. Was it simply a convenient plot device, or were authors genuinely grappling with the profound implications of a hidden self? The truth is likely a blend of both, and the very definition of identity. You saw characters literally walking the tightrope between sanity and insanity, between the polite facade of day and the wild, unbidden impulses of night. This cultural reflection didn't just entertain mesmeric spectacle and literary drama. It was only a matter of time before sleepwalking leaped from the pages of novels and the hushed clinics onto the brightly lit stage. You see, the 19th century loved a good show, and the bizarre, unsettling nature of somnambulism was perfect fodder for public entertainment. This gave rise to the phenomenon of stage somnambulists, individuals who either genuinely or, more likely, convincingly performed feats while supposedly in a deep, induced sleep. These weren't just quiet demonstrations. They were full-blown theatrical productions designed to astonish and perhaps even terrify their audiences. Imagine stepping into a grand theater, the gaslights flickering, casting dramatic shadows. The air buzzes with anticipation. On stage, a magnetizer or showman, often clad in dramatic robes, gestures mysteriously over a prone figure. You might witness them playing a musical instrument with surprising skill, reciting poetry, or even engaging in complex mathematical calculations. How could someone do all this while supposedly unconscious? It challenged their very understanding of the human mind. A mainstream historical fact is that these public demonstrations, whether genuine or artful deception, significantly contributed to the popular understanding and misunderstanding of both mesmerism and sleepwalking, blurring the lines between science and entertainment. These performances weren't always about high art. Sometimes, one quirky or fringe tidbit is that some stage somnambulists were advertised as performing impossible feats of memory, like recalling entire books read to them once, or even diagnosing ailments in audience members. You can just picture the skeptical gentleman in the front row, trying to catch a flicker of consciousness in the performer's eyes, while the more credulous ladies whispered about hidden powers. It was a golden age for hucksters and genuine mystics alike, all riding the wave of public fascination with the unknown corners of the human psyche. The allure was simple, seeing the unbelievable with your own eyes. Of course, the authenticity of these performances was constantly debated. Historians still argue whether the success of these public spectacles relied more on genuine hypnotic susceptibility or on clever illusion and the audience's willingness to believe. It's difficult to say from our vantage point, but what's undeniable is the profound impact they had on popular culture. They solidified the image of the sleepwalker as a figure of uncanny ability, someone who could access knowledge or skills inaccessible to the waking mind. This fueled both public curiosity and scientific skepticism, simultaneously encouraging further inquiry and cementing certain misconceptions. These shows served a dual purpose. They entertained, but they also implicitly asked profound questions. What was consciousness? Controlled by another, the stage somnambulist became a living, breathing paradox, a captivating mystery that left audiences buzzing long after the final curtain fell. They ensured that the obsession with sleepwalking wasn't confined to dusty medical texts or philosophical treatises. It was a vibrant, visceral experience right there in front of your very eyes. And as you left the theater, you couldn't help but wonder what strange things might be happening in your own mind long after you drifted off to sleep. Beyond the theatrical stages and the hushed medical clinics, the perplexing nature of sleepwalking began to cast a long, unsettling shadow into the very halls of justice. You see, when someone performs actions in their sleep, actions that might otherwise be considered criminal, it creates an enormous legal quandary. How do you assign guilt? How do you determine intent when the perpetrator claims to have been utterly unconscious, effectively not there? The 19th century, with its developing legal systems, found itself grappling with these profound questions, leading to some truly bizarre and ethically challenging court cases. Imagine the scene: a packed courtroom, gasps from the public gallery, and a bewildered jury listening to testimony about a person who, in the dead of night, committed an act that defies rational explanation. Perhaps they assaulted someone, or stole an object, or even, in more extreme cases, caused harm only to wake up with no memory whatsoever. A mainstream historical fact is that somnambulistic automatism became a recognized, albeit controversial, defense in various 19th century legal systems across Europe. This meant that if it could be proven, or at least argued convincingly, that an accused person was truly sleepwalking at the time of the alleged offense, their legal culpability could be drastically reduced or even negated entirely. The challenges were immense. How do you prove someone was genuinely asleep? There were number brain scans, no sophisticated polysomnography equipment. Lawyers and doctors had to rely on eyewitness accounts, the accused's own testimony, often of complete amnesia, and the expert opinions of physicians, who themselves were often divided on the precise nature of sleepwalking. You might hear of cases where the accused would recount a vivid dream that seemed to align with their nocturnal actions, further blurring the lines between conscious intent and unconscious enactment. It turned the courtroom into a stage for the subconscious, a place where the human mind's hidden depths were put on trial. One quirky or fringe tidbit from these legal proceedings is the lengths to which defense teams would go to prove somnambulism. In some instances, Attempts were made to replicate the sleepwalker's behavior in court, or even to induce a trance-like state in the accused, though such demonstrations were often met with skepticism and accusations of charlatanry. Imagine a defense lawyer trying to demonstrate to a judge that their client could indeed walk across the courtroom with their eyes open but be entirely unaware of their. It was a fascinating, if sometimes farcical, spectacle, highlighting the desperation to explain the inexplicable. Historians still argue whether these legal defenses were genuinely based on a growing understanding of altered states of consciousness, or were merely convenient loopholes exploited by clever lawyers. Was it a recognition of a genuine neurological phenomenon, or a way to escape justice for acts committed under cover of darkness? The ambiguity of sleepwalking made it a powerful, if ethically complex, legal tool. The very notion challenged the fundamental principle of mens rea, the guilty mind. If there was no conscious mind present to form intent, could there be guilt? These cases forced judges and juries to grapple with the profound implications of a human being acting without self-awareness, pushing the boundaries of legal responsibility and revealing just how unsettling the phenomenon of sleepwalking truly was when it manifested in the harshest glare of public scrutiny, while the public was entertained by stage somnambulists and baffled by courtroom dramas. The scientific community itself was far from unified on the subject of sleepwalking. You see, the 19th century was a time of burgeoning scientific inquiry, but also one of intense intellectual ferment and disagreement. There were no definitive answers, and every new observation seemed to spark a fresh round of debate. This era was characterized by fiercely contested scientific debates and early theories, attempting to pin down the elusive nature of somnambulism. It was like a very smart, very polite, but ultimately very stubborn intellectual wrestling match. Imagine the atmosphere in a learned society meeting. Gentlemen in frock coats, stern expressions, ready to defend their hypotheses with passion. Some prominent medical minds clung to purely physiological explanations. They theorized that sleepwalking was a disorder of the nervous system, perhaps a localized awakening of certain brain centers, while others remained asleep. A mainstream historical fact is that early theories often focused on the idea of dissociation, suggesting that parts of the mind or brain could operate independently of the conscious self. This was a revolutionary idea, laying foundational groundwork for later psychological concepts. They might propose that the motor cortex was active, allowing movement, while the frontal lobes, responsible for judgment and memory, remained dormant. Then there were the proponents of the psychological view, heavily influenced by the popularity of mesmerism. They argued that sleepwalking wasn't just a physical malfunction, but a manifestation of deeper mental states, perhaps repressed thoughts, or even a sort of second consciousness that emerged during sleep. You might find lively discussions about whether sleepwalkers were actually acting out their dreams, or if their actions were guided by some subliminal will. It was a fascinating, often heated, back and forth between the brain as a machine crowd and the mind as a mysterious entity. Contingent. One quirky or fringe tidbit is the theory that sleepwalking was sometimes caused by specific dietary habits or even the direction in which one slept. Imagine a doctor gravely advising a patient to avoid rich foods before bed and to always sleep with their head pointing north. as if magnetic fields were influencing nocturnal perambulations. It sounds almost comical now, but these were serious considerations in an era starved for concrete answers. They were grasping at straws, yes, but they were grasping with all the scientific tools and philosophies at their disposal. Historians still argue whether the varied and often conflicting theories of the 19th century hindered or accelerated the true understanding of sleepwalking. Did the constant debate and lack of consensus create confusion, or did it foster a necessary intellectual environment for diverse ideas to be explored? It's a complex question. While many theories proved to be dead ends, the sheer volume of inquiry and the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom ultimately pushed the boundaries of knowledge. The scientific community, despite its internal squabbles, was collectively chipping away at the mystery, slowly laying the groundwork for the more nuanced understanding we have today. They didn't have all the answers, not by a long shot, but they certainly asked a lot of the right questions, even if they sometimes answered them with leeches and north-facing beds. As the fascination with sleepwalking deepened across Europe, it wasn't long before the phenomenon began to intertwine with matters of the heart, or more accurately, matters of desire and scandal. You see, the 19th century was a period of strict social codes, particularly concerning propriety and sexual conduct. The idea of someone, especially a woman, acting out desires or engaging in illicit activities while completely unconscious was both titillating and terrifying. This gave rise to sensational and often morally ambiguous tales of the somnambulist lover, stories that whispered of nocturnal rendezvous and compromised reputations. Imagine the shock and whispered gossip in a small, respectable town when a young woman is discovered in the garden of a gentleman's house, clad only in her nightclothes, with no memory of how she got there. Was it an innocent sleepwalk or a clandestine meeting masked by an alleged trance? These were the kinds of questions that set tongues wagging and fueled the imaginations of a society obsessed with secrets and appearances. A mainstream historical fact is that societal anxieties about female sexuality and control were often projected onto phenomena like sleepwalking, sometimes leading to accusations of impropriety that were difficult to refute if the accused claimed unconsciousness. The narrative often revolved around vulnerability and temptation. The sleepwalker, supposedly devoid of conscious will, became a canvas upon which anxieties about uncontrollable desires could be painted. You'd read accounts, often highly dramatized in popular pamphlets, of individuals sleepwalking into compromising situations, revealing hidden passions, or even committing acts of infidelity, only to awaken with a blank slate. The very ambiguity of the state made it a perfect dramatic device. Was the sleepwalker truly innocent, or was their unconscious mind merely fulfilling a secret desire that their waking self dared not acknowledge? It was the ultimate blame it on the subconscious excuse, long before anyone truly understood what a subconscious was. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the belief, held by some, that certain magnetic or spiritual influences could guide a sleepwalker towards a specific person or location, almost like an invisible puppet master. This added an extra layer of Gothic intrigue to the concept of the somnambulist lover, suggesting that perhaps the sleepwalker wasn't entirely a victim of their own unconscious, but rather a pawn in a larger, unseen game of fate or manipulation. Imagine a distraught suitor trying to convince a skeptical father that his daughter, found in his arms at dawn, was merely magnetically drawn to him by an irresistible force. It was a desperate plea that rarely worked. Historians still argue whether these widespread tales of somnambulist lovers were genuine occurrences, sensationalized moral panic, or simply a reflection of the era's repressed sexual anxieties finding an outlet in a seemingly safe, fictional or semi-fictional form. Was it a way for society to discuss forbidden desires without directly confronting them? The ambiguous nature of the sleepwalker's agency allowed for a fascinating exploration of desire beyond conscious control. These stories, whether true or fabricated, played a significant role in shaping public perception of sleepwalking, imbuing it with a dangerous, alluring, and often scandalous edge that went far beyond mere medical curiosity, building upon the delicate dance between scandalous tales and medical diagnoses. The 19th century European obsession with sleepwalking often intersected with another pervasive societal construct, the perceived fragility of the female constitution. You see, this was an era rife with theories about women, hysteria, and sleepwalking, often conflating the three in ways that, from our modern perspective, seem deeply problematic and, frankly, a bit misogynistic. The female body and mind were frequently viewed as more susceptible to nervous disorders and emotional excesses, making them prime candidates for the mysterious affliction of somnambulism. Imagine the common narrative: a delicate, sensitive young woman, perhaps overwhelmed by the stresses of society or a thwarted romance, suddenly begins to wander in her sleep. Her nocturnal activities are not seen as a simple physiological malfunction, but as a manifestation of her overwrought nerves or unstable emotions. A mainstream historical fact here is that the diagnosis of hysteria, a catch-all term for a wide range of female complaints, from anxiety to fainting spells, was incredibly prevalent throughout the 19th century. Sleepwalking, when exhibited by women, was often slotted neatly into this vague and often disempowering category. Doctors, predominantly male, would frequently interpret a woman's sleepwalking as a sign of her inherent emotional instability or her inability to cope with the pressures of domestic life. You might find detailed case studies describing young women performing elaborate, often symbolic, actions in their sleep, which physicians would then attempt to interpret through the lens of their conscious or unconscious desires and frustrations. It was a fascinating, if ultimately flawed, attempt to psychoanalyze before psychoanalysis was even a twinkle in Freud's eye, often leading to conclusions that reinforced existing gender stereotypes. One quirky or fringe tidbit related to this connection is the popular belief that the lunar cycle had a particularly strong influence on female sleepwalkers. Imagine the idea that the full moon could specifically trigger a woman's somnambulistic episodes, exacerbating her feminine susceptibilities. This, of course, tied into ancient folklore about the moon and madness, but it gained a pseudo-scientific veneer when applied to women's supposed nervous dispositions. It was another way to explain the inexplicable, often by resorting to convenient, albeit unsupported, biological determinism. Historians still argue whether the medicalization of female sleepwalking as hysteria was a genuine attempt to understand a complex phenomenon, or merely a convenient tool for social control, pathologizing women who deviated from prescribed norms of behavior? Did it genuinely reflect a biological predisposition, or was it a way to dismiss and contain female agency? The implications were significant, often leading to treatments that focused on rest cures, isolation, or even more invasive procedures, all ostensibly to calm the hysterical nervous system. This approach often stripped women of their autonomy, reducing their complex internal experiences to a mere symptom of their gender. So, while men might be seen as sleepwalking due to some brain anomaly, women's nocturnal wanderings were frequently attributed to their inherent emotional and physical weakness, solidifying a narrative that persisted for far too long. While the burgeoning medical and psychological fields attempted to rationalize sleepwalking, the human mind, ever eager for a good mystery, couldn't entirely shake off the whispers of the unseen. You see, despite the gaslights and the scientific journals, a strong undercurrent of folklore and spiritualism continued to intertwine with perceptions of sleepwalking in 19th century Europe. The deep-seated beliefs in ghosts, spirits, and the supernatural didn't just vanish overnight. They merely adapted, often finding new ways to explain phenomena that science hadn't yet fully elucidated. Imagine a dark, moonless night, the wind howling through the eaves, and tales told by the flickering firelight. In such settings, sleepwalking wasn't always seen as a medical condition. Sometimes it was interpreted as a sign of being touched by spirits, a gateway for spectral entities to interact with the living world. A mainstream historical fact is that the 19th century witnessed a massive resurgence in spiritualism, a movement that sought to communicate with the dead through mediums, seance, and various paranormal phenomena. It was fertile ground for explanations beyond the purely material. If spirits could communicate through raps and levitating tables, why couldn't they influence a sleeping body? You might hear hushed accounts of sleepwalkers speaking in strange voices, seemingly channeling deceased relatives or uttering prophecies. These weren't always dismissed as mere medical symptoms. For many, especially in rural areas or within spiritualist circles, they were considered genuine evidence of otherworldly influence. The vacant gaze of the sleepwalker, their seeming unawareness of their surroundings, made them appear almost possessed, a vessel for forces beyond their control. This played into ancient fears and beliefs about the vulnerability of the soul during sleep, a time when it was thought to be untethered from the body. One quirky or fringe tidbit is the idea, embraced by some spiritualists, that sleep were experiencing astral projection, a supposed out-of-body experience where their consciousness traveled to other realms while their physical body remained active. Imagine the thrilling prospect of your sleeping self exploring distant lands or conversing with spirits, all while your body ambled about your bedroom. This provided a far more exciting explanation than a simple neurological hiccup, appealing to those who yearned for a world beyond the mundane. It transformed the sleepwalker from a medical patient into an unwitting explorer of the cosmos. Historians still argue whether the persistence of supernatural explanations for sleepwalking hindered scientific progress or merely reflected a broader cultural struggle to reconcile new scientific paradigms with enduring traditional beliefs. Did the spiritualist movement capitalize on public ignorance, Or did it genuinely attempt to explain phenomena that conventional science couldn't yet grasp? The truth is complex. While spiritualism often bordered on outright fraud, it also served as a space for exploring the mysteries of consciousness and the mind-body connection, albeit through a very different lens than that of medicine. So, while doctors meticulously documented brain activity, many across Europe continued to whisper about restless spirits and traveling souls, reminding everyone that even in an age of progress, the shadows of ancient beliefs still loomed large over the perplexing phenomenon of sleepwalking. As the 19th century began its slow march towards its close, and the clamor of mesmerists and spiritualists began to recede slightly, a different kind of curiosity took hold, the desire to measure, to quantify, to see what was happening during sleep. This was the era where nascent technological advances and sleep study began to tentatively intersect, marking the very earliest rudimentary attempts to bring empirical tools to bear on the elusive world of nocturnal phenomena. You see, up until this point, understanding sleep was largely based on observation and anecdotal evidence. But with new inventions bubbling forth, the potential for a more objective view started to emerge. Imagine a curious physician, perhaps less inclined to theories of animal magnetism and more interested in hard data, attempting to record the movements of a sleepwalking patient. While nowhere near the sophistication of modern sleep labs, these early efforts were groundbreaking in their intent. A mainstream historical fact is that the 19th century saw significant developments in instrumentation, particularly in areas like electrical recording and chronometry. Even if their application to biological phenomena like sleep was still in its infancy, these advances, while not directly leading to a definitive understanding of sleep stages, certainly laid the conceptual groundwork. You might find rudimentary devices designed to track movement, sleep. Picture an apparatus, perhaps a system of levers and pens, attached to a sleepwalker's bed, designed to chart their restless movements through the night. Or perhaps a very early form of a pulse monitor, attempting to correlate heart rate changes with different states of sleep. These were often clumsy, unreliable, and prone to error. But they represented a profound shift in methodology, from simply observing what a sleepwalker did to trying to measure how their body was functioning while they did it. Birth of sleep science, albeit a very, very young and wobbly baby. One quirky or fringe tidbit is the use of early photographic techniques, like chronophotography, to capture the sequential movements of sleepwalkers. Imagine a series of still images taken over time, painstakingly stitched together to create a visual record of a nocturnal journey. While challenging to execute with the limited technology of the time, such efforts represented a genuine desire to document and analyze the subtle shifts and complex actions of somnambulists. It turned the sleepwalker into a moving target for early camera enthusiasts, trying to freeze an ephemeral phenomenon. Historians still argue whether these early technological forays into sleep study were genuinely fruitful in advancing understanding, or merely symbolic gestures of scientific ambition with little immediate practical impact. Did they provide concrete data or simply reinforce existing theories? It's a valid question. The tools were primitive, the methodologies often rudimentary, and the interpretations frequently constrained by the limited knowledge of the time. However, The very act of trying to measure and record, of bringing an objective lens to such an intrinsically subjective experience, marked a significant intellectual leap. It signaled a growing belief that the mysteries of sleep, including the baffling phenomenon of sleepwalking, could ultimately be unraveled, not just through philosophical debate, but through careful observation, aided by the burgeoning power of technology. It was the first faint glimmer of the sleep lab of the future. As the 19th century wore on, and sleepwalking remained a persistent, perplexing mystery. Those individuals afflicted with chronic or dangerous somnambulism often found themselves in a new kind of institution, the asylum. You see, these weren't just places for the mad in the traditional sense. They became catch-all facilities for anyone whose behavior deviated significantly from societal norms or presented a danger to themselves or others. This is where we delve into the asylum and sleepwalking patients, a sometimes bleak, sometimes well-intentioned, but always fascinating chapter in the story of somnambulism. Imagine the sterile, often imposing walls of a 19th century asylum, a far cry from the comforting familiarity of home. For a sleepwalker whose nocturnal excursions led to injury, public scandal, or simply constant distress for their family, the asylum offered a supervised environment. Here, they could theoretically be observed, contained, and perhaps even cured. A mainstream historical fact is that the asylum system in 19th century Europe saw a dramatic expansion, attempting to categorize and treat a vast array of mental and neurological conditions with varying degrees of success and ethical consideration. Sleepwalkers, particularly those deemed uncontrollable, found their way into these facilities. You'd find detailed records, often written by diligent but somewhat bewildered attendants, documenting the nightly activities of these patients. They would describe bizarre sleepwalking routines, individuals dressing themselves perfectly, attempting to leave the premises, engaging in elaborate imaginary conversations, or even meticulously cleaning rooms to understand triggers and ultimately to prevent the dangerous behaviors. But the understanding of sleep was so limited that these observations often led to more confusion than clarity. It was like trying to fix a complex machine based only on watching its faulty movements, without access to a schematic. One quirky or fringe tidbit is the variety of treatments employed in asylums specifically for sleepwalkers. Beyond the previously mentioned cold baths and leeches, some institutions experimented with mechanical restraints to prevent wandering, or even the administration of sedatives derived from opium or belladonna, often with severe side effects. Imagine a patient still sleepwalking, but now heavily drugged, their movements sluggish and disoriented. There were also attempts at moral therapy, where patients were encouraged to engage in calming activities during the day, as if a tranquil, waking life would somehow translate into peaceful, sedentary sleep. It was a testament to the desperation to find a solution, no matter how unorthodox or invasive. Historians still argue whether the asylum's role in managing sleepwalking patients was primarily one of containment and control, or if it genuinely contributed to a better understanding of the condition through systematic observation. Was it a benevolent attempt at care, or a punitive measure to remove problematic individuals from society? The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle. While the methods were often crude by modern standards, the act of housing and continuously observing sleepwalkers did create a unique body of clinical data. It forced professionals to confront the reality of living with this enigmatic condition. And while their cures were often ineffective, their observations added another layer to the complex tapestry of the 19th century obsession with sleepwalking. Beyond the hushed medical journals and the imposing asylum walls, the general public's fascination with sleepwalking was constantly stoked by the sensationalist press of the era. You see, the 19th century was the golden age of newspapers and magazines eager to print anything that would sell copies and capture the public imagination. And few things captured imaginations quite like a bizarre or scandalous report of nocturnal perambulations. This is where we examine sleepwalking in popular periodicals, the unfiltered, often exaggerated lens through which most Europeans encountered the phenomenon. Imagine eagerly grabbing your daily newspaper or weekly magazine, settling in by the fire, and suddenly seeing a headline screaming about a midnight marauder or a somnambulist's strange sojourn. These weren't dry scientific reports. They were gripping, narrative-driven pieces designed to thrill and entertain. A mainstream historical fact is that the rise of mass media, with its increasing literacy rates and faster printing technologies, meant that sensational news stories, including those about sleepwalking, could spread rapidly across nations, creating a shared cultural conversation about these bizarre events. You'd find articles detailing harrowing escapes by sleepwalkers from burning buildings, or peculiar incidents of individuals rearranging their neighbors' furniture in the dead of night. There were often breathless accounts of sleepwalkers found in improbable places, on rooftops, in boats, or even miles from their homes, with no memory of their journey. The narrative usually played on themes of uncanny ability, mystery, and the sheer disbelief that a human could accomplish such feats while utterly unconscious. These stories often blurred the lines between fact and fiction, weaving in elements of urban legend and local gossip to heighten the drama. One quirky or fringe tidbit from these periodicals is the frequency with which they featured expert opinions from local luminaries, often not medical professionals, offering their own homespun theories on the cause of sleepwalking. Imagine a local vicar suggesting that too much rich food before bed was the culprit, or a town elder blaming it on bad humors or an alignment of stars. These common-sense explanations often appeared right alongside more serious scientific discussions, adding to the delightful confusion and conflicting narratives about the phenomenon. It was an intellectual free-for-all, all for the price of a penny. Historians still argue whether the sensationalist reporting of sleepwalking in popular periodicals primarily served to misinform the public, or if it inadvertently stimulated wider interest and discussion, prompting more serious inquiry. Did the exaggeration hinder scientific understanding by spreading misconceptions, or did it spark curiosity that eventually led to deeper research? It's a complex interplay. While accuracy was often sacrificed for drama, these pervasive accounts kept sleepwalking firmly in the public consciousness, ensuring that it remained a topic of lively debate and endless speculation. The newspapers, with their vivid prose and breathless reportage, were the ultimate amplifiers of the 19th century obsession, transforming a medical curiosity into a widespread cultural phenomenon. From the sensational pages of periodicals, it was a short, sleepwalking step into the enduring realm of classic literature. You see, the power and mystery of the somnambulist proved irresistible to 19th-century novelists, playwrights, and poets, turning the sleepwalker into a potent and recurring literary archetype. This wasn't just about adding a strange incident to a plot. It was about using the sleepwalker as a symbol, a vehicle for exploring deeper psychological, moral, and even supernatural themes. Imagine settling down with a thick, leather-bound novel, the lamplight casting shadows on the page, and encountering a character who, by day, is perfectly respectable, but by night, wanders through the darkest corners of their own psyche, revealing secrets they never consciously knew. A mainstream historical fact is that the Gothic novel, with its emphasis on mystery, the uncanny, and the hidden depths of human nature, provided an especially fertile ground for the sleepwalker archetype. Characters like Lady Macbeth, already mentioned, are just one iconic example of how the sleepwalker became a dramatic device to externalize internal turmoil. You'd find the sleepwalker used in myriad ways. Sometimes they were a victim, a fragile soul whose nocturnal wanderings highlighted their vulnerability or susceptibility to external influences. Think of a young woman, perhaps under the spell of a villainous hypnotist, compelled to act against her will while asleep. Other times, the sleepwalker was a tragic figure, consumed by guilt, their subconscious mind replaying or acting out a past crime or betrayal. This allowed authors to delve into the nascent understanding of the subconscious, exploring how buried thoughts and memories could manifest in bewildering ways when the conscious mind was at rest. It was a pre-Freudian dive into the psychological abyss, all wrapped up in a compelling narrative. One quirky or fringe tidbit is the use of sleepwalking to introduce elements of doubling or doppelgangers into a narrative. Imagine a character who encounters someone who looks exactly like them, but is behaving strangely, only to discover it's their own sleepwalking self. This allowed authors to play with themes of fractured identity and the unsettling idea that a part of oneself could operate entirely independently, almost like a separate entity. It added a layer of eerie philosophical complexity to an already mysterious phenomenon, pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be a unified self. Historians still argue whether the prominence of the sleepwalker archetype in 19th-century literature was merely a reflection of a popular cultural trend, or if it genuinely shaped and influenced the public's understanding of psychological states. Did literature merely exploit the fascination, or did it contribute to a more nuanced, albeit fictionalized, exploration of consciousness? It's a fascinating chicken and egg question. What's undeniable is the enduring legacy of these literary sleepwalkers. They etched themselves into the collective consciousness, becoming figures of mystery, pathos, and sometimes terror. By giving shape to the formless anxieties surrounding the unconscious, 19th-century literature ensured that the sleepwalker would remain a compelling and evocative figure, forever wandering through the moonlit corridors of our imagination, long after the real-life obsession faded. Section 14. From the sensational pages of periodicals, it was a short, sleepwalking step into the enduring realm of classic literature. You see, the power and mystery of the somnambulist proved irresistible to 19th-century novelists, playwrights, and poets, turning the sleepwalker into a potent and recurring literary archetype. This wasn't just about adding a strange incident to a plot. It was about using the sleepwalker as a symbol, a vehicle for exploring deeper psychological, moral, and even supernatural themes. Imagine settling down with a thick, leather-bound novel, the lamplight casting shadows on the page, and encountering a character who, by day, is perfectly respectable, but by night, wanders through the darkest corners of their own psyche, revealing secrets they never consciously knew. A mainstream historical fact is that the Gothic novel, with its emphasis on mystery, the uncanny, and the hidden depths of human nature, provided an especially fertile ground for the sleepwalker archetype. Characters like Lady Macbeth, already mentioned, are just one iconic example of how the sleepwalker became a dramatic device to externalize internal turmoil. You'd find the sleepwalker used in myriad ways. Sometimes they were a victim, a fragile soul whose nocturnal wanderings highlighted their vulnerability or susceptibility to external influences. Think of a young woman, perhaps under the spell of a villainous hypnotist, compelled to act against her will while asleep. Other times, the sleepwalker was a tragic figure consumed by guilt, their subconscious mind replaying or acting out a past crime or betrayal. This allowed authors to delve into the nascent understanding of the subconscious, exploring how buried thoughts and memories could manifest in bewildering ways when the conscious mind was at rest. It was a pre-Freudian dive into the psychological abyss, all wrapped up in a compelling narrative. One quirky or fringe tidbit is the use of sleepwalking to introduce elements of doubling or doppelgangers into a narrative. Imagine a character who encounters someone who looks exactly like them, but is behaving strangely, only to discover it's their own sleepwalking self. This allowed authors to play with themes of fractured identity and the unsettling idea that a part of oneself could operate entirely independently, almost like a separate entity. It added a layer of eerie philosophical complexity to an already mysterious phenomenon, pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be a unified self. Historians still argue whether the prominence of the sleepwalker archetype in 19th century literature was merely a reflection of a popular cultural trend, or if it genuinely shaped and influenced the public's understanding of psychological states. Did literature merely exploit the fascination, or did it contribute to a more nuanced, albeit fictionalized, exploration of consciousness? It's a fascinating chicken and egg question. What's undeniable is the enduring legacy of these literary sleepwalkers. They etched themselves into the collective consciousness, becoming figures of mystery, pathos, and sometimes terror, by giving shape to the formless anxieties surrounding the unconscious. 19th century literature ensured that the sleepwalker would remain a compelling and evocative figure, forever wandering through the moonlit corridors of our imagination. Long after the real-life obsession faded, Section 15, as the 19th century gracefully bowed out, giving way to the bustling 20th, the intense, almost feverish obsession with sleepwalking in Europe began its slow, inevitable fade. The spotlight shifted. New scientific discoveries captured the public imagination, and the peculiar mystique surrounding nocturnal wanderings started to dissipate. Yet, even as the widespread fascination waned, the fundamental mystery of sleepwalking lingered, a peculiar enigma that continued to prompt questions, albeit with less theatrical flair and more scientific rigor. Imagine the dawn of a new century. Electric lights replacing gaslight, psychology emerging as a serious discipline, and the public's attention being drawn to innovations like the automobile or the airplane. The sheer novelty of the sleepwalker had worn off, while cases of somnambulism still occurred and still occasionally made the papers. They were no longer the headline-grabbing sensations they once were. The doctors had moved on to new frontiers of the mind. The mesmerists had largely been exposed as charlatans, though hypnotism found a more scientific footing, and the literary archetypes were firmly established, no longer needing constant reinforcement from daily life. A mainstream historical fact is that the early 20th century saw the gradual professionalization and specialization of psychology and neurology, leading to more focused and less sensationalized research into sleep disorders. You'd find less public debate about whether a sleepwalker was possessed or merely experiencing a brain malfunction, and more quiet, methodical research. The shift was from public spectacle to laboratory observation. The dramatic theories of animal magnetism and hysteria, while leaving their marks on the historical record, began to be replaced by a more nuanced understanding of the brain and nervous system, even if that understanding was still in its infancy. The quirky or fringe tidbits of treatments and supernatural explanations largely disappeared from mainstream discourse, relegated to the dusty corners of historical texts or the fringes of esoteric belief. One quirky or fringe tidbit from this transitional period is the rise of early psychological studies attempting to link sleepwalking more directly to repressed childhood memories or traumatic experiences, foreshadowing the Freudian revolution in understanding the unconscious. Imagine psychologists beginning to see the sleepwalker's actions not as random, but as symbolic representations of inner conflicts, a silent language spoken by the subconscious mind. This moved the mystery from the purely physical to the deeply psychological, suggesting that the ghost in the machine might just be unresolved emotional baggage. Historians still argue whether the fading of the sleepwalking obsession was due to a genuine increase in scientific understanding, making the phenomenon less mysterious, or simply a change in cultural priorities as society found new anxieties and fascinations to fixate upon. Was it truly solved, or did people just get tired of talking about it? The reality is likely a combination. While a definitive cure for sleepwalking wasn't found, the relentless 19th century inquiry, even with all its missteps and wild theories, laid the critical groundwork. It normalized the idea that the mind operates on multiple levels, that consciousness isn't a simple on-off switch, and that the night holds secrets within us. So, as the curtain falls on this journey through 19th century Europe, you can almost feel the collective sigh of relief, as if society finally decided to let its nocturnal wanderers just wander. The intense, almost theatrical fascination may have quieted, but the fundamental mystery of what the human mind does when we are truly asleep, when the lights are out and the world is still, remains. Sleepwalking, in all its perplexing glory, continues to be a fascinating reminder of the incredible, often unsettling, capabilities of our unconscious selves.